I want to start with the one fact that explains Iran better than any missile launch or tanker fire. The man who is supposed to make the final decision cannot make a decision at all. Mojtaba Khamenei, appointed as Iran's new supreme leader after his father was killed, is lying in intensive care. He cannot arbitrate. He cannot tell the diplomats to sign a deal. He cannot tell the Revolutionary Guards to stop firing. He cannot decide whether Hormuz opens or closes. And in a regime built for more than 40 years around one final voice, the silence at the top has become the most dangerous sound in the Middle East. That is the real story. Not simply that Iran's president wants Hormuz reopened. Not simply that the foreign minister told the world commercial ships could pass. Not simply that the IRGC fired on tankers anyway. The real story is that all of those things happened inside the same regime. One hand opened the door, the other hand shot through it. That is not strategy, that is fracture. For decades, Iran's system was complicated, but it had a center, the presidency, the parliament, the Guardian Council, the Revolutionary Guards, the clerical establishment, and the security services all fought for influence. But above them sat the supreme leader's office. When disputes became too dangerous, that office decided that was the design. Then the design was shattered. Ali Khamenei was killed. Senior commanders and officials were eliminated. The old command architecture was decapitated. Mojtaba Khamenei was pushed into the role to create the appearance of continuity. But then he disappeared into a hospital bed before he could become a real center of power. That turned the supreme leader's office from a source of authority into a weapon every faction can claim. The diplomats can say they are acting for the state. The IRGC can say the diplomats have no real mandate. The president can warn the people that the country is nearing disaster. The propaganda machine can pretend the people support the war. And nobody at the top can impose one answer. That is why Iran now looks like three governments trapped inside one body. The first government is the war government represented by Ahmad Vahidi and the IRGC for them. Escalation is not, it is institutional survival. In war, the guards are indispensable. In peace, people begin asking what they cost, what they destroyed, and why their power grew while the country became poorer. The IRGC's budget, influence, proxy networks, and internal authority all depend on the existence of danger. A deal threatens that structure. Reopening Hormuz threatens that structure. A serious negotiation threatens that structure. So for Vahidi, peace is not just a concession to America, it is the beginning of an audit. That is why firing on tankers is not only a military act, it is a political veto. It tells the negotiators, you may speak, but we control the guns. The second government is the survival government, represented by Ghalibaf, Araki, and Pezeshkian. They are not revolutionaries turned Democrats, they are regime survivors who can read the numbers. Iran's infrastructure is damaged. The currency is under pressure. Oil storage is filling. Wells may soon be forced to shut down. Revenue is collapsing. The public is exhausted. They understand something the hardliners do not want to say aloud. A regime can survive humiliation better than it can survive economic suffocation. Ghalibaf's logic is not sentimental. It is structural. If Iran does not negotiate, the state may lose the economic base. It needs to function. If the oil wells shut down under stress, the damage may not be temporary. Production capacity can be harmed even after a deal is reached. That means every day of blockade does not just cost Iran today's money. It can damage tomorrow's recovery. That is why time is no longer neutral. Time is now an enemy. Pezeshkian's statement landed so hard because he said what the public already knew. He said Iran faces a massive reconstruction crisis. He said there is no stable funding path. He said the people must be told the truth inside a system built on slogans. That sentence is almost an accusation. It implies the official story is not enough. It implies the people know more than television admits. It implies the regime cannot keep asking for sacrifice without explaining what the sacrifice is buying. That is why the third government matters. The people, state television can claim overwhelming support for continuing the war. It can say the people are united. It can present invented certainty as patriotic fact. But the deeper reality is different. Many Iranians see this war as the regime's war, not their own. Many blame the authorities for the country's condition. Many want relief, stability, and change before they want another speech about resistance. That gap between propaganda and lived reality is not a messaging problem. It is a legitimacy problem. And legitimacy is the one reserve a government cannot print, borrow, or smuggle through a shadow fleet. This is what makes the Hormuz crisis so explosive. For 40 years, Hormuz was Iran's ultimate weapon. Tehran wanted the world to believe that if Iran were pushed too far, it could threaten the artery of global energy. But now that weapon has become a cage, Iran can close the strait and cause fear, but it also traps its own oil. It can threaten shipping, but that scares the customers it still needs. It can use Hormuz to pressure America, but it also pressures China, Gulf states, and everyone whose economy depends on predictable flow. A weapon that hurts everyone can become a weapon that isolates the user. That is what is happening. Now, China is the clearest example for years. Beijing was Iran's most important economic lifeline. China bought Iranian oil. China helped keep channels alive. China benefited from discounted supply and used Iran as a piece in a larger strategy against American pressure. But China did not support Iran because it wanted chaos forever. China wants flow, oil flow, trade flow, maritime flow, predictability. When China speaks to Saudi Arabia about keeping Hormuz open, that is not a small diplomatic detail. It is Beijing telling the region that the waterway matters more than Tehran's internal factional fight that weakens the IRGC. It strengthens the negotiators. Not because China suddenly loves moderation, but because China's own interests now point toward deeper escalation. Russia's position is even colder. Moscow can condemn the blockade and speak as Iran's partner while preparing to sell energy into the markets Iran is losing. Every barrel Iran cannot move creates room for Russia. Every day, Iran's oil remains trapped, gives Moscow more leverage with China and other buyers. That is not friendship. That is replacement dressed as solidarity. So look at the board. America is applying pressure. Israel has damaged Iran. Gulf states want Hormuz open. China wants flow restored. Russia is ready to benefit from Iran's weakness. The Iranian public is exhausted. The president is warning that the truth must be told. The foreign minister is signaling openness. The IRGC is firing on ships, and the supreme leader cannot speak. That is not a normal crisis. That is a command fracture. The outside world keeps asking whether Iran will choose diplomacy or escalation. But that question assumes Iran is still a single chooser. The real question is which Iran wins before the deadline forces the answer. There is the Iran that wants a deal because the economy is nearing a point of permanent damage. There is the Iran that wants conflict because conflict protects the institution that dominates the state. There is the Iran of ordinary people who are paying for a war many do not believe is theirs. And above them all is an empty chair. That empty chair is why the next few days are so dangerous. A negotiated settlement requires more than words, it requires enforcement. If Araki signs, but the IRGC fires, the deal is not real. If Pezeshkian promises relief, but the guards control the water, the promise is not real. If Ghalibaf negotiates, but the supreme leader's approval exists only as a fiction, the mandate is not real. No one wants to sign an agreement with half a government. That is the problem. If the negotiating camp can hold enough authority, there is still a narrow path out. Hormuz can reopen, oil can move, China can stay engaged, Gulf states can breathe, Washington can pause, Tehran can claim survival instead of surrender, but if Vahidi wins, the path is darker. The strait stays unstable. Tankers remain targets, talks become theater. The blockade tightens, oil wells move closer to shutdown, the public grows angrier, China distances itself, Russia replaces Iranian supply, and the IRGC preserves its own role by destroying the ground beneath the regime. That is the danger. Not that Iran is strong, that Iran is divided. A strong enemy can be deterred. A rational enemy can be negotiated with. Even a weak enemy can make a deal if it is unified. But a fractured regime with armed factions, collapsing revenue, public anger, foreign pressure, and no functioning final authority can start something. No one intended because no one has enough control left to stop it. That is what Washington is watching. That is what Beijing is watching. That is what the Gulf states are watching. They are not only watching Hormuz, they are watching whether Tehran still has a center, because when the foreign minister says open and the guards fire, the issue is no longer only policy. The issue is command, and when command breaks inside a state, sitting beside the most important oil choke point on earth. The next crisis does not have to be planned. It only has to be allowed to happen. The deadline is near. The oil clock is moving. The factions are circling each other. The people are losing patience. The allies are hedging. The enemies are waiting. And the man who was supposed to decide cannot open his eyes. That is the most dangerous fact in Iran today. Not a ship, not a missile, not a speech. An empty chair at the top of a regime that can no longer agree with itself.